Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. It's been over 2 years now since ESO debuted the Antiquity system, and at this point there are quite a few good mythics to choose from. So in this video I'll cover 6 of the best for PvE DPS. We'll run through their strengths and weaknesses and hopefully give you all a better idea of when to use them. This won't be a ranking from number 6 down to number 1, as these are all the best at what they do, just made for different situations. So first up we have the Harpooner's Waiting Kilt. This one is medium armor and the mythic bonus is dealing damage, grants you a stack of Hunter's Focus for 20 seconds up to 10 stacks max. You can only gain 1 stack of Hunter's Focus per second. Each stack of Hunter's Focus increases your critical chance by 1/10 and your critical damage by 1%. Taking direct damage removes 5 stacks of Hunter's Focus up to once per second. Removing Harpooner's Waiting Kilt removes all stacks of Hunter's Focus. So at the maximum of 10 stacks, this is 11-10 critical chance, which is 5%, and 10% critical damage. Really strong offensive bonuses for only taking up 1 slot. At those max stacks, we're looking at roughly a 7 to 8% DPS increase, and this can vary by a percent or 2 depending on your specific loadout and scenario. So what are the strengths? Really strong offensive bonuses, easy to maintain proc condition, as you can maintain those full 10 stacks by only needing to land 1 direct damage attack every 20 seconds, and this does include light and heavy attacks, so it's really easy to keep that up. And then being a medium leg slot, it is very flexible for any type of build, as you'll generally always want at least 1 medium piece no matter what the rest of your setup looks like. So what are the weaknesses then? You do have to avoid direct damage to keep your stacks going, so this is useless for solo encounters as that will be unavoidable there. And then some group encounters also have direct damage that you won't be able to avoid, so for those particular encounters you'll probably get less than great results as your stacks will often be resetting. The 20-second timer on this is usually long enough within an encounter to not fall off, but it definitely is short enough to fall off if there are longer delays between engaging with enemies. And then finally, there is the crit damage cap of 125%. If you are running with a highly optimized group, or depending on your class and race choice, you might end up in a scenario where that 10% crit damage is wasted and you're only benefiting from the crit chance that it offers. So in that scenario, this would drop from a 7 to 8% damage boost down to like 3.5–4% range. So now that we know the strengths and weaknesses, when is a good time to use the Kilt? This is very commonly used in 12-person trials, as many of the encounters you face will allow for you to easily maintain the full 10 stacks. Not all of them, there are definitely exceptions, but for many encounters that it does work on, it works really well. Most of the time, if you know you aren't going to lose many stacks and you also aren't consistently sitting over that 125% crit damage cap, this will be the best choice for DPS. There is a spreadsheet that was put together as well from Alec with a K that goes over the different trial fights. I'll link this in the description. It is a little bit out of date, but I'm going to work on possibly taking this over and getting it updated in the near future. So overall, the Kilt is really good, but definitely not the best for every scenario. So let's go through some of the other options. Next we have the Sea-Serpent's Coil. This mythic is a necklace. And by the way, ignore the traits on these. Protective is just what this naturally drops in. You generally always want Divines on the body pieces and Bloodthirsty on the jewelry for PvE DPS. So the bonus is, while at full health, you gain 40% damage reduction. After taking damage while at full health in combat, you gain Serpent's Rebuke for 10 seconds, snaring yourself by 40% and gaining Major Berserk and Major Courage, increasing your damage done by 10% and weapon and spell damage by 430. The damage resistance does not apply while Serpent's Rebuke is active. So we have some really strong bonuses on this thing, pretty much like 2 5-piece bonuses in one. However, they are named buffs, so they won't stack with other buffs of the same type. Major Courage is very commonly provided by support, probably the most common buff you can count on receiving in an organized group. And then Major Berserk is much less common, but it is provided to 6 group members for 8 seconds every time a Sorcerer's Atronach is synergized with. So just something to keep in mind if you have those bad boys flying around in your group. If we just look at the bonuses alone, assuming both are always active, this would theoretically provide somewhere around a 14 to 15% DPS increase. And again, this can vary by a percent or 2 depending on your specific loadout and scenario. However, unlike the Kilt, this one is much harder to get high uptimes with. To keep it active, you need to take damage, so that might mean dipping your toe into stupid every so often. But taking damage won't refresh that 10-second timer while the timer is still ticking down. Unlike the Kilt, it has to run all the way down before you can trigger it again. So there will always be a tiny little bit of downtime there, even if you are really on top of it. But you can get 85, in some cases close to 90% uptime or so if you are really managing it well. but that's going to drop that percent boost down to the 12 to 13% range, which is still really strong. However, this is assuming that you are benefiting from the major courage that it provides. So some groups will coordinate it to where the healer will drop their major courage set, like Spell Power Cure, if all of the damage dealers are going to wear Sea-Serpent for a fight. And then this frees up the healer to run another set, maybe something like Saxhleel, and give higher major force up time to everybody. Or you're just going to do a dungeon or some solo stuff and you don't have anyone providing that major courage. Point being, if you are benefiting from both of those bonuses, then it is going to be quite a large boon to have this. And in this scenario where you are benefiting from both bonuses, you generally would only need about a 55% uptime or so on Sea-Serpent to beat out the Kilt at its max 10 stacks. So definitely doable numbers there. But let's say you do have somebody providing major courage already, as you commonly do in most dungeon or trial groups. That's going to drop the total effectiveness of this set by a fair bit. Major Berserk is a 10% damage done bonus, but remember in ESO, these bonuses are additive with other percent bonuses, not multiplicative. So that 10% is generally going to be closer to the 7.5 to 9% range for our DPS increase, depending on what other buffs we currently already have going. And then when we factor in the 85 to 90% uptime at the very high end, we're looking at roughly a 6 to 8% DPS increase if you can keep this up nearly perfectly. So this does put it about in the range of what the Kilt offers when that is kept up at full stacks, but Sea-Serpent is a bit more difficult to manage for most fights. There are some encounters though, such as Locustes in Sunspire, where you're going to be taking constant ticks of environmental damage, and you won't really have to worry too much about trying to keep this up. So to summarize with the strengths and weaknesses. For the strengths, really strong offensive bonuses equivalent to 2 5-piece set bonuses crammed into a 1-piece set. The 40% damage reduction from the initial hit taken to trigger this can also be pretty nice in some situations. This can free up a support set if you have all of your DPS utilizing it. And then since it triggers from any kind of damage, you can manipulate it to work for you for any encounter that has persistent ground AoEs or environmental damage. For the weaknesses, in some scenarios, the uptimes are difficult to keep high as you have to be ready to immediately trigger it again when the 10-second timer runs out. It's not an issue if there's constant environmental damage, but it can be tricky on some encounters. Also, the bonuses are named buffs and therefore can be redundant. And then finally, it does put a 40% snare on you that can be pretty big if it's not accounted for, but I found if you do have a source of major expedition, such as Twisting or Refreshing Path, that combined with the Celerity Champion Point node will pretty much negate the snare, and it isn't too rough to deal with. But it is there and can be fairly noticeable if you don't have any speed boosts going. So when would be a good time to use Sea-Serpent? Fights where the Kilt stacks can't be kept up well, or you would be consistently over the crit damage cap with the Kilt. Scenarios where you don't have major courage provided, either intentionally to make room for another support set, or because you are solo or maybe in a pug group. And then fights with constant environmental damage, such as Locustes in Sunspire or Reef Guardian hard mode in Dreadsail Reef. Overall though, the Sea-Serpent Coil can be a really good mythic for DPS. For PvE use, I definitely don't have it in as many loadouts as I do the Kilt, but it definitely has a place and can be very strong. Next up on the list is Mora's Whispers. This is a light shoulder piece, gain up to 1528 critical chance and 10% increased inspiration, alliance rank, alliance skill, and 15% monster kill experience based on how many books of Shalador's library have been collected. So Shalador's library is the set of books that you collect to level up the Mages Guild skill line. So good news, if you've already done that, you won't have that many more books to collect to max this thing out. But if you haven't started it yet, it is quite the grind. I looked it up, and according to UESP, it is a collection of 297 books. And the worst part is that it is character-based, not account-based. So while it is a very nice bonus, I can imagine many people won't be using this on too many characters, as it will be really grindy to get it set up multiple times. But once you have it set up, it's good to go. It's just a static bonus that you get. No conditions necessary in combat to have that damage boost, no stacks to keep up and maintain or anything like that. And some nice XP stuff on the side as well if you're trying to grind out some skills or levels. Looking at it from just an offensive perspective, the 1528 crit chance is about 7%, so 2% higher than you'd get from the Kilt at max stacks. But it doesn't have the 10% crit damage like you'd get from the Kilt. So Mora's will generally be about a 4 to 5% DPS boost depending on your situation. So definitely solid, but not quite what the Kilt or Sea-Serpent's Coil can do in situations where those work really well. To compare, this would be worth roughly 60% uptime on the Kilt, which is definitely doable on many encounters, and to compare to Sea-Serpent, again around 55 to 60% uptime if you are only using using it for the major berserk. However, if you are missing the major courage, you would need about a 30 to 35% uptime on Sea-Serpent to beat out Mora's Whispers, which is pretty low. You should be able to do that pretty easily. All right, for the strengths, nice damage bonus, though not quite as high as the Kilt or Coil. Unlike those two, though, the bonus is always present. No worrying about losing stacks or maintaining buffs, so just really nice to set and forget. And then some nice experience gains to go along with it. For the weaknesses, it is a shoulder piece, so unfortunately that rules out using a monster set for setups that might allow for a full 2-piece monster set and a mythic to go together. And it's quite a grind to max the bonus out on it, and it is character based, so that grind will have to be done multiple times if you want to use this on multiple characters. So overall, when is a good time to use Mora's Whispers? Assuming you do have that bonus maxed out, if you're just wanting something easy to slot and not worry about switching things around for different encounters, it's great for that. Also, Mora's can be really nice in situations where the Kilt stacks are not easily kept up, and then even in fights where the Kilt might be good, but let's say you're sitting over that crit damage cap pretty consistently, since Mora's does have slightly higher crit chance than the Kilt does, and you don't have any stacks to worry about. And then of course, if you are doing activities to gain XP to level skills or anything like that, it's a pretty easy choice since it does have that bonus there. All right, next up, we're going to switch gears a little bit. The 3 mythics that we just discussed are probably the most common for group play, especially in 12-person trials. However, there are some other mythics that are very solid too. The first of those is Ring of the Pale Order. This one is restore 20% of the damage you deal as health. This value is decreased by 4% per ally you are grouped with. You cannot be healed by anyone but yourself. So quick little chart here to break down that healing amount based on group members. If you are running solo, you'll be getting the full 20%. Running with a group of 2, you'll get 16% of your damage returned as health. Group of 3, 12%. Group of 4, 8%. Group of 5 is 4%. And then anything beyond that, this will no longer add any healing to you. And since you can't take outside healing while wearing this, well, I've definitely run into some situations where someone accidentally had this slotted in a trial, and it's pretty funny to watch them die over and over because the healer can't do anything for them. So there are some interesting quirks with this. If you do have a companion out, they will count against your group size, so you'll only heal for that 16% instead of 20, but the no outside healing stipulation does not count for the companion, so you can still receive their heals plus 16% of your damage is healed. So if you do have your companion set up as a healer and you're running Pale Order, good luck dying with that going. Another interesting thing is that procs do not count for the healing, so any item set that you might be wearing, such as Pillar of Nirn or Reliquin, the damage from these is not converted to healing. And the same goes for pet damage, so Sorcerer pets, the Warden's Bear, Necromancer pets, none of the damage from those will be converted to healing. The Volatile Familiar is a little strange though, his normal attacks do not count. However, his 20-second ability that you activate will count and return to you as healing. So just a few little things that I thought were interesting and wanted to share with you all. For small groups with no healer, this is a pretty nice option, but really the main place you see this is for solo play. So let's talk about the strengths. Really strong incoming heal that is based on your damage dealt. It frees up bar space that might have been used on survival skills, and then frees up actions in combat that might have been used on survival skills. So while there is no damage bonus on the ring itself, the freeing up of bar space and actions in combat can actually turn into a nice DPS boost for the wearer, since you'll be spending more time just focusing on dealing damage and possibly having more damage abilities slotted. And then for the negatives, it can't be used in groups of 6 or more. There's no outside healing in any group size, and then no offensive bonus. So for scenarios where you don't need much healing, it could be a bit overkill and you'd have been better off slotting something for damage. So when is a good time to use Pale Order? Really can't go wrong with it in solo content, especially useful in getting through veteran solo arenas. Or maybe you're trying to be a mad lad like Luke and do a solo trifecta run of a dungeon. Yeah, good luck with that. And then it's also nice in smaller groups if there is no healer present. All right, next up on the list is Thrassian Stranglers. These are light armor gloves. Killing an enemy grants you a stack of Slode's Call for 1 hour up to a maximum of 50 stacks. Each stack increases your weapon and spell damage by 23, reduces your maximum health by 120, and reduces the effectiveness of your damage shields by 1%. Slode's Call is lost if you remove Thrassian Stranglers, go invisible, or crouch. So at the max stacks, this is going to be 1150 weapon and spell damage. This puts it roughly at a 14 to 16% DPS increase depending on your specific scenario, and this makes it the highest damage that you can get from a mythic, assuming you can get to those 50 stacks. But in that lies the biggest issue with using it. It requires you to get the killing blow on the enemy that dies in order for a stack to be gained. So for a lot of group content, especially 12-person trials, there simply aren't enough enemies, especially when you are splitting the chance to get a killing blow with 11 other people. So by the time you would get to a decent point for stacks to match damage with something like the Kilt, for instance, you'd need to get up to like 24 stacks or so to match that. Well, if it takes too long, you've spent most of the encounter losing damage to get up to that point, and you could have been wearing something else. So while we're on this, let's look at what Thrassian can do compared to other DPS mythics. These are just rough estimates as various factors can change the specifics, but as I mentioned, it passes the Kilt at around 24 stacks or so. If you are using the Sea-Serpent for both the Major Courage and the Major Berserk and getting 85% uptime on that, it takes about 40 stacks to pass that up, but comparing it to only benefiting from the Major Berserk there, as you normally would in most situations, that would be about 23 to 24 stacks to pass it up, similar to the Kilt. And then compared to Mora's Whispers, Thrassian would pass that up at about 16 stacks. So let's go through the strengths and the weaknesses. For the strengths, highest damage potential of any mythic in the game. And then for the weaknesses, it can take too long to build to be useful, or simply won't ever max out for many encounters in the game. And then if you do get to those max stacks, you have some negative bonuses to go with it, such as 6k less health and 50% reduced shield size. And then even though the bonus lasts for 1 hour, it can't be traveled with, so you can't stack it up before entering a dungeon or a trial or something, and the bonus is also removed upon dying. So seems like a lot of negatives there. So when would actually be a good time to use it? Well, first off, you need to be confident with the lower health pool. And then second, a situation where you can get enough killing blows and preferably get them rather quickly so that the bonus can be useful for the majority of the encounter that you're in. So this might be solo content, or maybe a 4-person dungeon or arena that has enough enemies where sharing between a small group still allows for you to stack this pretty quickly. Black Rose Prison, for example, has a ton of ad waves, and if you are confident with that lower health pool, this can be a great option to really push high damage there. So overall, this is definitely a more risk versus reward kind of set, and you don't see it as often as some of the other mythics we've gone through due to that killing blow requirement, but it definitely has a place for some encounters if you really want to push the envelope and try to max out your DPS. Ultimately, it's up to you. Really powerful if you can get the bonus stacked up quickly enough for it to be useful and you're confident that you won't be dying, losing that bonus, and having those stacks reset on you. And then last but not least, for the top 6 mythics, we have Oakensoul. So just an absolutely insane amount of buffs here on this ring, but it is pretty unique in that it disables the ability to bar swap once it's equipped. Since you cannot use a back bar, you give up 5 skills, a secondary ultimate, along with the back bar enchantment, which usually would be an infused weapon damage enchantment worth 452 weapon and spell damage. So I won't be directly comparing the bonuses you get from Oakensoul to the other mythics because there are just too many moving parts. Losing a whole skill bar and stats from that, it just makes it really complicated. So instead I'll show what it adds for someone that wants to do a 1-bar setup compared to if they didn't have the item. So for what Oakensoul enables, this thing is pretty amazing. We'll start off with the offensive bonuses. For the minor ones, the 5% damage done from Minor Berserk, you won't often have solo unless you're slotting Camo Hunter. And then even if you were, well, there's a bar slot freed up now. 215 weapon and spell damage from Minor Courage also won't be there solo, so that's a nice chunk of weapon and spell damage that helps make a dent in that missing back bar enchantment. Minor Force is commonly obtained with Barbed Trap or Channeled Acceleration, so Oakensoul will provide that for you and allow for other skills to be slotted instead. Outside of Oakensoul, the 5% damage done bonus from Minor Slayer is only obtainable from the 3-piece bonus you get on trial sets, so what this does is allow you to not have to wear trial sets and you still get that 5% damage done bonus. So that makes lots of non-trial set combos really good here with Oakensoul. And then finally, that Minor Heroism bonus can be really nice for the extra ult generation, and you don't need to use expensive heroism potions. For the major offensive buffs here, these are the ones that are commonly found on potions, but sometimes skills are run for these as well. Either way, Oakensoul frees you up to not need to worry about getting these from your potions or skills. And then finally, for the offensive bonuses, this one is not really doing much here for a typical light attack build, but the Empower buff, which increases your heavy attack damage by 80%, is really huge for heavy attack builds. Just an absolutely insane bonus, and it's permanently active. So when we look at group play, we definitely can still benefit from a lot of these, but Minor Berserk is one of the most common buffs that we'll get from our healers using Combat Prayer, and most situations you're going to have this already in group play. And then Minor Courage is also a really common support buff that you will receive, usually from the set Yolnahkriin. So on the offensive side of things, these two can be a bit redundant, and it cuts down on the effectiveness of the set a bit. So moving on to the other bonuses for our resources, we have Minor Fortitude, Intellect, and Endurance, adding 15% to each of our recoveries. Very nice for solo, but again, these could be buffs that you are already provided in an organized group. And then Oakensoul's defensive buffs are Minor Protection and Minor Aegis. These are not too common for a DPS to be getting, so it's really nice to just have a free 10% damage reduction when you add both of those together. And then Major Resolve increases your armor by 5948, which is roughly a 9% damage reduction. So that can be really nice to have for sure. But again, in group play, this might be redundant if that is already provided for you in the group by a warden using Frostcloak. And then to top it all off, you also get a nice healing buff with 8% extra healing from Minor Mending. Usually in group play, you won't be responsible for too much of the healing, though it can shine in select spots. But for solo, this is another really good one to have for sure. So one of the nice things about Oakensoul is that many of these buffs that you'd get here would come from skills that you would need to make room for on your bars to slot in a more traditional build. So it's great to just get those buffs without having to cast anything. So even though we end up with less skill slots, it isn't nearly as costly as it might initially seem. But on the other hand, those skills would usually offer some kind of secondary function as well, like Hurricane, for example. This has to be cast every 20 seconds to give you the same major resolve that Oakensoul gives you permanently. But Hurricane has very nice damage as well during that 20-second period, so it's nice to keep it up. And then there are many others like this for the various buffs that you're getting with Oakensoul. So let's summarize it. The strengths, we are getting more buffs on Oakensoul than any other set in the game offers. It fills in a lot of the gaps for buffs that you would normally need to manage yourself, so that makes that a bit easier. And then it also allows for a much easier set of skills to keep up while still maintaining respectable damage levels. So pretty nice to have a more simple setup that can still do well. For the weaknesses, 1-bar builds are going to be about 15 to 20% lower usually in their very top end capabilities. So comparing what the very best you can get with a 1-bar build versus the very best that anyone can get with a 2-bar build. But to many players, that'd be worth the trade-off for the simplicity that it offers. And then for many others, that gap is probably much smaller than that because they would manage that 1-bar build much better than they would manage a 2-bar build. So even though the top end is 15 to 20% apart, for someone it may be 5% apart, or they might even do better with a 1-bar build than a 2-bar build due to that easier setup. And then next, all of the buffs are named, so there are many scenarios in which you will have overlap and they will be redundant, especially in group play. For solo, you're still typically able to benefit from the majority of these. And then finally, there's just less flexibility overall when choosing your skills, since you only have 5 and an ultimate instead of 10 and 2 ultimates. So when would be a good time to use Oakensoul? It's pretty great if you just want a more chill, laid back kind of setup that can still produce enough damage for the majority of content in the game. I have a couple of videos here on YouTube doing the newest dungeon trifectas on the first day they came out with Oakensoul on my Magicka Sorcerer. And I've also seen some really strong Oakensoul heavy attack builds out there as well. So it's definitely a nice option if you don't want to mess with 2 bars. Using both bars will still get you the higher top end results, but not by that much, especially solo, and this will get you there a lot easier. All right, so those were my top 6 mythics for DPS. I did want to do a quick honorable mention section and run through 3 more that I thought were at least worth a brief discussion. Death Dealer's Fate is pretty solid, though with the more recent mythic introductions, I really don't slot this nearly as often as I used to. To be honest, I can't remember the last time I actually used it. It's been a while, but it does cap out at 2640 of each of your 3 resources. It takes 1 minute to build up to that amount though. And this comes out to somewhere around a 2.5 to 3% DPS gain, so definitely a little lower than the other options we went through, but you do get the extra 2640 health too, so that can be pretty nice if you want to be a bit more tanky. Then we have the Marken Ring of Majesty. This is pretty similar to Death Dealer in the type of power that it offers. So this one's bonus is valued off of how many sets you're wearing at least 3 pieces of. So in most typical PvE loadouts, you aren't getting more than the 200 weapon and spell damage and 2314 armor, which isn't bad. It comes out to pretty similar to Death Dealer's Fate in damage at about 2.5 to 3% additional DPS, and then around 3.5% resistances. The nice thing here compared to Death Dealer is there's no build-up period to get there. You just always have that bonus. So that is one perk. And then if you do happen to be running in a setup that maxes out the value on this, you'll get 300 weapon and spell damage and 3471 armor. So that would be closer to 4 to 4.5% more damage and 5.3% resistances. So pretty solid stat lines there for an always active set. Pretty close to what you get with Mora's Whispers for damage, but also some additional resistances on top of it. But as I mentioned, there aren't really too many common PvE configurations that would allow you to benefit from this being maxed out here. So the Mark and Ring of Majesty doesn't see a whole lot of use as a PvE DPS set. And then finally, the Spalder of Ruin. This one is not a DPS gain for the wearer, but it does add 260 weapon and spell damage to your group mates. The biggest downside here is that you lose 70 of each of your recoveries for each ally that you're benefiting, so up to 420 of each of those lost. This can be pretty brutal, especially with how popular hybridization has become, and trying to use your off resource stat with gimped recovery can be really tough. Generally, you'll see this on a support over having a DPS wear it, since it's a bit easier to manage that way, but it is an option to put it on a damage dealer if your group needs to add that in, so that's why I wanted to make sure I at least mentioned it here in the honorable mentions. Since Mythics were first introduced in Greymore, we've now had several updates that have added new Mythics, leaving us with quite a few good ones to choose from. We've had some roller coaster rides of balance changes for some of these, but it feels like, at least from a PvE perspective, that there's a pretty fair balance of options to choose from now. So I hope this was helpful for you to know when it's best to use some of the top Mythics for DPS, but that's going to do it for this video. Thank you all for watching, and a big thanks to my current Patreon and YouTube members. I really appreciate all the continued support. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougar is Bait in the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Melandia, Florian, Vidridi, Cha-Cha, Unemployed, and Chryseliana. Thanks again for stopping by. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.